11:05, so we'll need to start our lecture. Before we start our normal lecture for today, I'm going to invite two students from RoboCup to give an introduction about RoboCup. I think Red Sweet. Yeah, hand over to them. You can stand in front of here so that online students see you. The camera is here.
Sweet. Well, hello there online, and hello to all of you that made it in person.
Yeah, we're from Rostock, and my name is EJ, and this is Stefan. And I'm gonna start by sharing a childhood story of mine. When I was a kid, I used to watch one of the anime. There was humanoid, like robot player playing soccer, and most of the time they actually beat humans. They can do like crazy shots.
Sorry.
They can do like crazy shots, and some of them break the net. They can break other robots too sometimes. But when I joined the team last year, I feel like, oh, that's my childhood dream come true.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool. Actually.
So we're recruiting right now in term 1, so this could be a chance to join the team.
Yes.
I will let Stefan to share more about the recruitment process and the bootcamp we're running.
All right, so there's a lot of things we do on the team. We do a lot of things with computer vision, a lot of things with machine learning, a lot of things with like localizing carbon filters, a lot of complicated robot stuff. But you don't need to know any of that to join the team. What we're going to be doing is, if you scan that QR code, it takes you to our link tree. And the first thing we have there is an application form. Fill that in, and we'll put you in the running to be in our boot camp. Now in our boot camp, we teach you all the stuff with robot operating systems, so ROS2. That's what our robots run on. And through learning that, we'll obviously be seeing how well you guys are at problem solving and all that sort of stuff. But technical skills, we're not emphasizing that right now. We just want people that are kind of locked in, willing to put in the effort to learn. And applications were going to close tonight, but because we weren't able to make it to your previous lecture, I didn't come in. We're actually going to extend that deadline to, I believe, tomorrow night, so tomorrow at midnight. It's not a long application form, but try to make the most of it. Sort of tell us everything you know and any background you have in these sorts of areas. But again, we're looking more for like an aptitude to problem solving and stuff. And if you do make it into the team, we're going to be going overseas shortly. We're going to be preparing for the International RoboCup World Cup in Brazil. So there's a lot of stuff to be done. But thank you for letting us in, and hopefully we'll see you around on boot camping sessions. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Great, thank you. This is a great opportunity actually for students who are asking to learn more about, the Mac voice. For online. Yeah, I think this is actually a great opportunity for you to practice more software engineering stuff. So you can have other projects other than what you have learned in the course, and also practice what you have learned in the courses. So yeah, if you have time, if you're interested in that, I do encourage you to apply and join the team.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very much.
Alrighty, so now let's get back to our normal course contents. Where we were last time. Okay, requirement engineering. So before we talk more about requirement engineering, can anyone just give us an idea about why this matters? Like, why do we need to do requirement engineering? Why is it important? Why do we need to talk about it? Hey, free pants, where are you? Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
To figure out the direction that you want to go as a group.
Yeah, so figure out the direction that you want to go as a group, other than like when you have implemented something and then you realize, well, this is not needed, not required. Okay, cool. So this is actually so that we build the right system. That's perfect from online. So actually this is very important because when I was supervising students doing software implementation in their final year, a common mistake that I found is our software engineering students that are very passionate about coding, programming, solving the problem, but they kind of running too fast without actually understanding what is the problem to solve. So they assume a problem to solve, and they solve the problem. So they may hopefully in the future sometime there may be such kind of problem that their solution can be useful. Well, they didn't actually realize that more importantly, before they implement anything, they need to find the problem, the real problem from the users. Okay, cool. So now let's go back to where we wrapped up from last lecture. The first step for requirement engineering. So remembering the steps for first we need to elicitate the questions, the problems to understand, to talk with stakeholders, and then we analyze what we collected from the elicitation process to analyze the data, and then we do some documentation, specification, and the last phase was validation. Okay, so the first step was elicitation. Very commonly used method is the interview. So we do interviews with stakeholders. The stakeholders can be end users, who will be using the system, who will be impacted by the system, or domain experts, or even engineers who maintain and develop the software. So they are all stakeholders. So we can have interviews with them. So now the question is, how do we have the interview? So what are the qualities of good interviews? So talking with people is easy, right? So we just find them and we sit down with them and we have a chat. But how to make sure that we have a good quality interview, that we are not, we are making good use of the time and the resources as well. Yeah. Sorry, what? Yes, that's a very good one. So determine the goals of the interview. So what do you want to learn from the interview? Right, so this should be think before we start the interview. We can have just one sentence or two sentences. What do you want to get from this interview? That's a very good one. So after you identify that, how do we get the questions for the interview? So what are the good qualities of interview questions? I will start with the first one. Try to be open-minded. So a lot of time we may have a solution in our mind already before the interview. But that is our idea, not the stakeholder or the end user's idea, right? So we need to try to be open-minded when we are talking with the stakeholders. So they may have different opinion. Their experience may be different from you, right? So you try to be open-minded other than saying, well, do you have this problem? So that indicates that you think that is a problem. So you give the interviewees the impression, well, this may be a problem that they need to raise. We try to ask open-ended questions like, what are the problems you are facing? For example, for to-do list system. So do you face any challenges with using existing to-do list systems? So ask this kind of open-ended questions. What are the other ideas about coming up with good quality interviews? Oh, someone noted answer. So I will give it another one. We try to ask following up questions. So when they say, I have a problem with adding tasks to blah, blah system, and then you can ask why. Ask following up question to understand what was the reason behind that they had those challenges. So you can solve the more fundamental issue or challenges for them. Ask more questions like why or how. For example, if they mention they use system blah, blah, you ask how do you use that? Right, so ask more questions. Okay, so these are some tips for you when you're doing the interview. So after you have done the interview, for example, you had interview with 5 stakeholders, and then the next step is you sit down and take a look at the interview data. So while you're doing the interview, you may take some notes, right? Some students may also prefer to record the interview. So you have a transcription after the interview. Now you have the data from the notes, from the transcription. Now the next step is to analyze the data. So what you may want to get from the data is what is the common challenges from those 5 interviewees. Maybe not 5 of them, but 4 or 3, like majority of them are having a very similar or common challenges. So maybe that is the one that you want to solve. Okay, or you may notice some conflicts. some people say this feature is very good, the other person may say it's not very good. So then you may need to understand them and maybe also identify why there are the conflict, why they have different perspectives. You may also like have the priorities. Maybe you identify 10 challenges, like you want to solve all of them. But we need to pick one of them to solve first, rather than solving 10 of the challenges, but none of them is done in a very good quality. Right? So we also need to prioritize them. For the process of prioritize them, you mean like which challenge or problem is more common raised by the interview? The majority of them have this challenge, or they want to have a new feature for that one. Or it may be because some features are really hard to implement, or those challenges is really hard to solve. So maybe you want to solve them that can benefit users in a shorter time, rather than solving the most challenging one at the beginning. It may also relate to some constraints from your team, like the skills, limits, constraints, or hardware constraints, or money constraints. So when you are doing the prioritization, you may consider those constraints or which one is more important. And then after that, you may need to consolidate them into user stories, user cases, or do some conceptual modeling. What are they? We'll talk about them in the second half of this lecture. Okay, so we'll go through the process, and then we'll talk more details about the user stories and use cases. Okay, so after we collected the data, we did an analysis, and now it's time for us to have a document like a spec called specification. Remembering that this is not a design document. We don't need to document like how we solve the problem. So that is too early to think about that, like how to solve it. But more importantly is write down the problems that we need to solve. Remembering that we don't want to go too fast and solve the problem too quick. We need to first write them down, have a spec of the problem. And this is kind of an agreement between the developers and other stakeholders. So this is like a contract or agreement between the stakeholders. So you can go back and validate them, validate the spec with the stakeholders. So just problems at this phase, no solutions yet. So that's very common misunderstanding here. Okay, so after you have the spec, the next step is we validate that, with the stakeholders. So why is this important? Like we have done all the process, why do we still need to validate whether it's correct or wrong? This is because in many cases, for example, the end users, they don't really know what they need. They may have, or they have different terminologies they use that our developers or designers, they don't really understand, or they misunderstand some of the terminologies in a specific domain, for example, health or privacy, or what is it. So this is the step, like after you have the spec, you go back to the stakeholders and confirm, validate the spec with the stakeholders. Did I miss anything? Did I understand what you said in the interview properly? Right? Is this the term that what I define is the same as what you define it in your domain, in your specific domain? Right? So this is where you go back to the stakeholders and validate your spec with them before you actually start to solve the problem. Okay? We'll also talk more about validation today, but just go through the process. Also, there are some like very common challenges during requirement engineering. So requirement engineering is not a very simple process. Like it's different from coding, programming. It's more about like communication and interaction with the stakeholders. So it's more challenging sometimes. Some of the challenges that you may see is, for example, requirements sometimes only understood after design build has begun. So when you start actually design the system, like after the requirement engineering phase, you thought you have validated that. But maybe later you realize, well, this is not correct. Like we still need to go back to the stakeholders. Or sometimes the client or customers, they don't actually know what they want. So this is very common as well. So we need to talk with them, communicate with them. And client or customer sometimes change their mind. Well, this is also very common. They change their mind maybe because they just changed their mind, or maybe because there are some new technology that they want to try and use, or maybe because there are some new laws, some new regulations that they need to follow, right? Another challenge is developers may not understand the subject domain. Well, this is so true. So for example, in health clinic domain, or there may be a lot of terminology, a lot of laws, regulations, or privacy concerns that our developers don't really understand. So in an agile world, it is strongly, or in modern software engineering world, it is strongly recommended that the software engineers are involved in the interviews in the whole requirement engineering process. So the developers have direct interaction or communication with the clients to understand their domain, rather than just reading the spec from another people. Okay. We may also sometimes have limited access to stakeholders. I remember there was a project about building an education system for Africa people, or some specific area in the world for people over there. But for developers or software engineers, we may not have enough access to those people to actually talk with them. So we may need to do some research about like documentations online or whatever to understand their problem as much as we can. And the last one is the very, very common mistake. Like I have mentioned that a couple of times now. So jumping into details of solution too early. So I also made this mistake myself for many, many times. So now I try to tell myself again and again, understand the problem first before you jump into the solution. Okay. Cool. Perfect. So now we have wrap up the requirement engineering, the process. So we have now talked about the whole process. Now we mentioned earlier about here user stories and use cases, like how exactly we do the analysis. Now we'll talk more about them. Okay. So why do we need that? We need to model what we have learned from the interviews, from the focus group, from the market research. We need to model them. Otherwise, which is very long documentation about the notes you take from the interview or the market research that you have done. It's not that easy for software engineers to understand like what they need to build. So we need to have a way that is easier to communicate to the software developers and also to communicate with other stakeholders. And the way we use is called user stories or use cases. So what are they? So use cases is more commonly used in traditional software development process, such as waterfall model or waterfall process. This is the use cases is used to specify each function that the system should have. So for example, for a forum system, the system should help the users to log in the system. The system should allow the users to post a new question. The system should send emails when there's a new notification, right? So these are called use cases. So use cases specify the functionality of a system by specifying the behavior of the system. So mainly it's used for functional requirement. Remembering that there are two types of requirement, functional requirements and non-functional requirements. And use cases are mainly used for use cases and the user story, they are mainly useful for specifying the functional requirement, like what the system can do, or what the users can do with the system, like the functions. Okay. So use cases are normally written in the language that all stakeholders can understand, like dialogues or plain communication, rather than having a lot of technical terminologies. So it also considers the system as a black box for the user cases, that you do not need to specify what is happening exactly within the system. Like for example, there's a button there and how you design the button, how's the interface, like what is going on at the back end. So normally when we have use cases or user stories, we treat the system as a black box. It's just how the users can interact with the system. That's it. Okay, so it's normally written in the form of the system shall do something or the system should do something. Let's have a look at some examples first before we talk more about like how we get them. So here are some examples about use cases. This is the simplified version of use cases. For example, the one, system shall keep the door locked at all times unless commanded otherwise by authorized user. When the lock is disarmed, a countdown shall be initiated at the end of which the lock shall automatically armed. So this is an example of a use case. It describes what the system can do. Another example, the system shall lock the door when commanded by pressing a dedicated button. So what the system can do, right? So these are functions. Or the system shall give a valid key code and lock the door and activate other devices. So this is a list of requirements. So you can also see on the left-hand side, there's a column called priority. So the first one is of the highest priority, should be able to lock or unlock. And maybe there are also others of like less priority. So these are should be analyzed after you conduct the interview, market research, or focus group. But this is a simplified version of use cases. So in many other cases, we need to have more details for it. For example, the context, the background for each requirement. There may be also circumstances that we also need to have a scope of it. Sometimes we also need a precondition. So for example, for the system to be able to send a notification to a user, the precondition should be the user is part of this system, right? So they have registered in the system. Otherwise, they shouldn't receive the notification or be able to post on the system, on the forum, right? So in many cases, we need to have a precondition. Or another precondition for post on the forum is that the user should already be logged into the forum so that they can make a post on the forum. So those are preconditions. Sometimes there will be like success and condition. Like, what do you mean by the process or the scenario is successful? And sometimes there may be failed and condition. So for example, what happens if the user logging unsuccessfully to the forum? Their password is wrong. What system should react to that? Right. Let's see some other examples. So this is a more complete use case example. So first of all, we need like pretty short description or the title of this use case. For example, this is our auction system, online auction system. And use case 1 is put an item for auction. Like this is use case for the users who want to have an item for auction. Right. The primary actor for this use case is the seller, like who want to sell something. And the precondition here is the seller has logged in so that they can have something for auction listed on the system, on the auction system, right? And then there's the main success scenario. If everything works well, the scenario will be like step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4. However, there may be some exception scenarios when part of the step was unsuccessful or there's something different from what we expected. So for example, let's have a look at this main success scenario. The first step is the seller posts an item. And the step 2 is system shows past the prices of similar items to seller. However, what if there's no prior similar items? Right, so the system cannot show the seller the prices of the prior items, right? So there's an exception scenario for this step 2, which is there's no past item of this category. Then what happens? The system should tell the seller this situation. Right. Another example, this is a use case for the buyer. The name for this use case 2 is called make a bid. So the buyer can make a bid. And the precondition here is the same, that the buyer has logged in. And we also have a main success scenario. Right. The first one is the buyer searches or browses and selects some item. The system shows the rating of the seller, the starting bid, the current bid, and highest bid, and asks the buyer to make a bid. So what the system does, right? And the buyer specified a bid price, the system accepts the bid, system update the max bid price. Again, there will be some exception scenarios. For example, for step 3, the bid price, what if the bid price is lower than the current highest? What? So this shouldn't happen, right? So this is an exception scenario, it's not the success scenario. And the system should inform the bidder and ask them to rebid. So this is like an option scenario that is different from the most successful scenario. So this is how use cases is formatted. And you may notice that there are many different ways of framing use cases. So the format can be different. So what is included in use cases can also be different. So you may want to add more to them, to this use case. So for example, you may want to add some like trigger. What triggers this action? What is the scope of them? So sometimes these are necessary, but sometimes they are not. But we all need to have a scenario for a use case, like how the user interacted with the system to achieve a goal. So the user scenario, the scenario is the most important part, but sometimes we need to have a precondition. For example, the users need to log into the system, but for some systems, there's no login, right? Not all systems requires login. So sometimes there's no precondition, and it is also okay. But in other cases, there are preconditions that we need to make to be able to have the interaction between the user and the system. Okay, so how can we get those use cases? So we need to identify the actors and the goals. So who is interacting with the system? For example, seller and buyer. They are the actors. And then what are the goals? Auction, selling something, buying something, right? And we need to have the main success scenario. Sometimes we need to consider the failure conditions or failure handling, but it's not compulsory. It just makes sense in some cases. Okay, any questions so far about use cases? All good? Yeah, you may have like new questions after you actually start drafting or writing the use cases. That's okay. Like you can always again post on the forum and let us know. Another way of having use cases is by drawing use case diagrams. So this is perfect for people who are like interested in drawing and more confident in drawing. So sometimes it can be easier to write with those visual diagrams. For example, this user, they want to withdraw some money from an ATM machine. So this diagram illustrates their interaction. For example, here, the ATM asks like, enter your PIN, okay, and the user entering their PIN number, and the ATM verify the account and send information to the server. The server will validate the account and tell the ATM their balance. And then the ATM will come back and say, how may I help you? And you just say, can I withdraw $60? And then please take your cash, collecting cash, and then send the ATM machine communicate back to the server. Well, there should be less $60 in their account. Right. So this is another optional way of having use cases rather than just writing them, but you can have a diagram. But you can, again, write down the scenario. So this is not a complete use case, but the scenario part, like how the customer interact with the ATM machine, the successful scenario. We got a question from online asking what does black box mean? So black box here means that we do not need to think too much about what is happening within the system or how does the technology work. We only need to think about how the user interact with the system. Like for example, the user enter pins and the system ATM validate account is PIN. But we do not need to think too much about how does the validation works or how the system verify the user's account. But for now, for use cases, for requirement engineering, we can think of the system as a black box. So we only consider how the user interacts with the system. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Okay, so that's all about use cases. So use cases, as we mentioned earlier, is more commonly used in traditional software engineering. In waterfall model, like we start with requirements before we do any implementation. However, you may also have noticed that writing all these use cases can be very time consuming, right? There are too much details in there. And before we actually implement anything, we already spend a very long time identify those requirements, identify those use cases, having so much details there, right? So in more modern software engineering, in an agile world, what is more commonly used is called user stories. So user stories, so there are two differences. First, user stories are much shorter. Like you do not need to have a precondition. You do not need to have a full scenario. You do not need to have what if something didn't happen as expected, everything. So we do not need all of those details. So this is the first difference. So you can start implementation earlier. So you do not need to spend the long time figuring out the detailed use cases. Another difference is that user stories put user at the center. So user stories are not described as the system showed you something, the system showed you something, but described as a user, the user can do login, the user can withdraw money from the ATM. So they put the user at the center. So this aligns better with agile development. Like the design or development should be user-centered. So no matter what software you design or developed, we are designing for the user. We are implementing for the user. The system will be used by the user, right? So the user is the center of any software system. So when we write user stories, we put the user at the center. So for example, we can have, as a student, I want to purchase a parking pass so that I can drive to school. So this is an example of a user story. Okay, so there's a very common structure we can use or we can follow when we write user stories is as a type of user, I want to some goals so that for some reason. So when you write user stories, you can follow this structure so that it will force you to put the user at the center and think of what a user can do with your system rather than what the system can do. Right? Okay. So a user story is much shorter comparing with use cases. It's just intended to contain just enough information so that developers can produce some effort to implement it. Just enough information, right? The aim is to avoid some waste of time, like often happens in software development process. Like we spend a lot of time, and then maybe we realize there's something wrong, or we want to change something, and then we need to go back to the process again. But user stories are much shorter, and we can gather them early. But and similar with use cases, they are normally written in non-technical language. So both user stories and use cases, they are written in non-technical language. The reason is because we want to communicate the user stories with all stakeholders, right? So the technical language can only be understood by the developers, but maybe not the users. Or we want to confirm, validate, and discuss the user stories with all stakeholders. So they are written in non-technical language. And again, it's focused on keeping the customer at the core of the experience. It's user goal focused, not product feature focused. So this is a core difference from use cases again. Again, this is the same with use cases that user stories ideally describe the problem, not the solution. So remember that we are still at a requirement engineering phase. No matter whether it's use cases or user stories, we are still at a requirement engineering phase. So we are targeting to understand the problem rather than thinking about the solution. So let's do some practice together. Let's try to write out some user stories for a to-do list. The structure is, as a user, I can do something because of something. I will go first. As a user, I want to add a to-do item so that I can keep track of my to-do list. Yep.
As a user, I want to add a new list.
Sorry?
As a user, I want to add a new list.
You want to add a new list. That's a good one. So that you can categorize the different lists, right? Other than adding everything onto the same list. So I would suggest that after what you have mentioned, like as a user, I want to add a new list. And then add something like, why do you want to do that? So what was the ultimate goal that you want to achieve? So for example, you can change that to, as a user, I want to add a new list. So I have separate list for my to-do items. Yeah, any other ideas? It's a good opportunity to practice. Yeah. Can you have a complete user story? Try to have a complete.
I want to add labels so that I could categorize, like I could see how much progress is done on each task.
Yeah, that's a good one. But I recommend that before what you have mentioned, as a user, and then blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so as a user, I can add a label to my to-do item so that I can keep track of them instead. Yeah, that's also a good one. The reason that I emphasize that we need to add as a user is because in this case, we only have one type of user. But in other cases, we may have different type of user. For example, the forum system. There are admins, there are tutors, and there are students, and there are lecturers. And they may want to do different things, right? So for example, if it's a forum system, I should say, as a student, I want to ask questions on the forum so that I can solve my problems while I'm learning a course. Or as an admin, I want to analyze the forum data so that I can keep track of blah, 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 right? So you can see that sometimes as a user it's enough because there's only one type of user, for example, for the to-do list. But sometimes there are different type of user, and we want to specify which type of user that this user story is for. Right? So try to follow the structure here on the slide. As a type of user, I want to do something so that for some reason. Yeah. Any question? Or anyone want to have a new user story for to-do items so that you can get some feedback early? All good? Yeah, here's one from online. As a manager, I want to share lists with others so that we can work together. Yeah, this is a good one. So you can see that it's not a general user, but a manager. I want to share a list because I want to work together with my team. Okay, so this is the structure of user stories. Here are some good practices of user stories. So for user stories, we try to make them independent from each other because the way that we work in an agile world is given a user story, I can pick one. For example, I want to work on this user story for my week 1. Right? I don't want it to be dependent on another user story so that I cannot do it if the other user story is not done yet. So we try to have independent user stories. Sometimes it's possible, but sometimes it's not possible. But we try to have independent user stories. We also try to make it negotiable so that we can always go back to the stakeholders and say, is this what you want? Do you want this to be like that or that? So it's negotiable. It's not too detailed as like in the use cases. User case is very detailed. It's like complete. But user story we want to be flexible. Like we can always go back to the stakeholders and communicate with them. The next attribute is being valuable. All of our user stories should bring some value to the users. Otherwise, why are we making that? Like spending time, putting effort on that user story, right? So all user stories need to bring some value to some types of users. And also need to be estimatable as much as possible, so you know how long you can finish that user story. Right? And we also try to have user stories that are as small as possible. You do not want to block 1 month for one user story. So what if something changes during the month? Right? And we should also make it testable. So how can we know that we have completed this user story? Right? It needs to be testable as well. So how do we make sure that it's testable? How do we write testable user stories? So for example, the one that we had, as a manager, I want to share a list with others so that we can work together. How do I know that I have completed that? How do I know whether what I've done can be accepted by the users? So this is where we introduce the user acceptance criteria. So before we implement a user story, we try to get a user acceptance criteria. So this is also co-design with stakeholders. So ask them, what is your definition of acceptance of this user story? So again, this will also be written in natural language, can be understandable by all stakeholders. So let's see an example first before we're talking too much about that. So here's an example. The user story here is, as a user, I want to use a search field to type a city, name, or street so that I can find matching hotel options. This is a very good user story. It's pretty specific. Like we mentioned that search can sometimes be vague, right? But it's pretty clear here that what they mean by search. Like they search by city, name, or street. And the purpose that they want to search is because they want to find matching hotel options. So it's a pretty complete user story. Now the user acceptance criteria for this user story is the search field is placed on the top bar. Search starts once the user clicks search. The field contains a placeholder with gray color text, where are you going? The placeholder disappears once the user starts typing and the user can't type more than 200 symbols. So you can notice that when we start, the user acceptance criteria becomes more detailed. And these are also important information before we actually implement things. So for example, the first one is the search field is placed on the top bar. So if we don't know that before implementation, we may design the search field at the bottom, right? So if we don't know this, like the gray color text, where are you going? We may just have no prompts in the search bar. Or we may have like red color, blue color, or whatever. And then when we get this back to the customer, the client will say, oh, this is not what I want. So it's better to clarify those with the stakeholders. So stakeholders may not have a complete list. That's also okay. When we try to design the user stories, they are pretty small, they are negotiable. We can always go back to them and negotiate with them. But we need to have a starting point. Cool, here's another example. The user story here is, as a user, I can log in through a social media account because I always forget my password. Oh, I forget my password a lot. Okay, so the user acceptance criteria here for this user story can log in through Facebook, can log in through LinkedIn, can log in through Twitter. Because social media account can be a lot of many options, but which one do we want to have for this system? Okay. Yeah. So before reading all of this, you can read that after the lecture. So what do you think what kind of criteria do you think the user acceptance criteria should have? Storage password?
Storing passwords of all the social media accounts?
Yes, sir. Yes, sorry, password for social media account. Yeah, so this is something we should avoid. But like in general, not for that specific example, like in general for user acceptance criteria, what kind of thing that we should pay attention to? Like I'll give an example. Acceptance criteria should not be too broad. For example, we need to specify like social media what kind of social media. So we need to try to make it not too broad, or like we can't have like a list of like 10 or 20 social media. It's just 3 social media, right? Not too broad. Another example can be minimize technical details. Again, this user acceptance criteria is also a document that we use to communicate with the stakeholders. We don't want to overwhelm them with too many technology or like technical detail terminologies. Any question about the user acceptance criteria? I can feel like this is less exciting than like when we talk about programming coding. So it's okay, we'll talk about coding very soon after the break. Yeah. What about we have a break for 5 minutes and then we come back, because I can see some of us is pretty tired already. So let's come back at 12. Okay, have a break. And we'll talk about coding, programming, JavaScript again, like hope to get you excited again. Cool. Hey, got a question? Yeah, sure, of course. Mute this one. What was the question?
Questions for data.mt. Are we meant to write descriptions, or is this fine without a description?
Oh, it's optional, so it means it's okay.
So the next question is the database going to be an actual database, or is it like a locally stored one? So like once the user closes the website, it's going to just...
Oh, that's a very good question. So we'll talk more about persistence in a later lecture. But for now, it's just local. It's okay if we close the website and all the data disappear. It's okay. We'll talk more about like making sure we are not losing data when we close the website in a later future lecture.
So that's going to be part of the project.
Yes. Yeah, but not now. Yeah.
If you close the website, it's gone, and the clear function is going to use.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so now I have two choices. One is we finish everything about requirements first, which will take about 15 to 30 minutes, and then we talk more about JavaScript. The other option is we talk something exciting about JavaScript for about 30 minutes, and then we come back to requirements. Option 1 or option 2? Option 1, hands up please. We finish everything about requirements, and then we go to JavaScript. Yeah. Option 2, we talk about JavaScript, and then, oh, it's half almost. It's so hard. 2? Yeah, I feel like we have more 2s. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk some exciting topics about JavaScript, give you some energy, and then we'll go back to requirement engineering. But we'll talk like half an hour and then half an hour. So for the rest, 1 hour. Okay, more JavaScript, modifier and importing. So it's very easy, but you will need to use that. Okay, so what do we mean by modifier? Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So now, yeah, option 2 online as well. Okay, so in this lecture, we're talking about what if we want to use some functions from other files. So in C, you may also have similar experience that you have a file with helper functions, and then you call those functions from another file. How do we do that? Another scenario is there's some predefined functions from JavaScript. In C, you can also include some like studio.h, right? But in JavaScript, you can do something similar, that you can also use like predefined functions from JavaScript that you do not need to write from scratch. Like, how do we do that? Okay, first, importing libraries. Let's have a look at JavaScript built-in libraries. So in C, what you do is you include studio.h, right? In JavaScript, we can do something similar, but just different syntax. The idea behind, the logic behind is the same, just the syntax is different. And what we do in JavaScript is we use import. So we import fs from fs. So fs here, the second fs, is similar to studio.h. It's like a library. And there are a lot of functions. And this fs is the one that we want to use in the current program or the current project. So we import fs from this fs. So we do not install them. So these are inbuilt libraries that we can use directly. Okay, some more example. In C, what we do is we include this library and we use the function here. In JavaScript, it's similar. Like we import it, pass from pass, and then we can console log and use the functions from this pass library. And the pass here is like an object. And this object has a lot of methods that we can use. And the method that we use here is the pass resolve one. Okay, I will show you how it works. Oh, too big. Okay, so we import pass object from this pass library, and we can use the method or functions from this pass object. Let's call it. So make sure that I'm at the right directory. Yeah, it is. Can anyone remind me how to run a JavaScript? No. And then file name, which is pass.js. And then this is the pass. It's a very long one here. So this is how we use built-in libraries from JavaScript. The idea behind it is the same as C. It's just the syntax is different. So pretty straightforward. Okay. Any questions so far? Like with using JavaScript built-in libraries? Yeah. What is dot resolve? So when we import something, like this is an object that we are importing, and this object has a few methods or functions. These are built-in from JavaScript. And we are calling the method or function called dot resolve. these are from past. So you do not need to remember all the built-in libraries from JavaScript. All you need to do is, if you want to do something, you can try to search on Google. Like, is there a built-in library for something? Like, when you are becoming more experienced, you will be familiar with the mostly commonly used ones that you can call directly from, like using directly from import from those built-in libraries. It's like when you are using a terminal, you do not need to memorize all the potential command code, right? You just need to use the most commonly used one. And in case you have a problem, you want to solve a problem that you have never solved before, you just search, you Google. Yep. So this is something different from 1511 as well, because I heard that in 1511, you got a list of the functions, the method, or whatever. But in 1531, we do not do that for the reason that JavaScript is much more powerful than C. So there's endless functions. There are a lot more like built-in libraries. And you do not need to memorize them. You just need to Google and search. I also do that myself. So it's very common. Even for very experienced programmers, they still search on Google. So it is OK. Like, you do not need the list of functions to be used in JavaScript or the list of built-in libraries. You do not need that. OK. Cool. Okay, so what if we define our own function and we want to import our own files? For example, now we have this function which is many strings. What it does, you can have a quick read of this function. It makes a new string which repeat the string for repeat times. So for example, if we console log many string 5 hello, what do you think will be console logged? Hello, 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 hello for 5 times. Right? Yeah, this is how it works. So what if we want to put this myString function in a file, like where we have a lot of functions, and then we call this myString function from another file? How should we do that? The first option to do it is by, is it too small for, is it OK for, can you see it clearly from the back? OK, cool. So what we can do is we can create a file called helper function.js. And we define all the functions here. So now we only have one function, which is the myString function. And then we export this myString by using export default, followed by the function's name. Yeah, question? OK, yeah. No problem. Why is it not working? What I'm going to do is like this. OK, is it better? OK, cool, perfect. So the way that we do that is by using export default to export this function so that we can use this function in another file by using import. So after we export default this myString, we can, in another file, import myString from this file. OK, I'll show you in here. Where is it? Split after. Yeah, here's the one. So we export default this myString, and then we import string hello from. So do you have a question now? Is there something weird? Yeah. Yeah. So why? So the function that we exported was called myString, but I somehow renamed it as string hello, although it's from the same file. Why? The reason is because when we use export default, it means that there's only one single function that we are exporting from this file. So we can only use export default when there's only one single function that we are exporting from this file. And also because there's only one single function was exported from this file, when we import, no matter how we name it, JavaScript knows which function we are actually importing. So we can rename it to however we want. So it can be useful in the cases where, like, for example, here, like when we define the function, it can be very general. But in a specific problem we want to solve, we can rename it to a specific one. So for example, here is many strings. But here I'm writing a project for a forum system. So I can rename this as like forum or forum hello. So we can have more specific terms that carry more meaning for our specific project. So that can be useful in that cases. Any question? And we need to make sure that the name we are calling is the same as what we had from here. So we can't have many string hello here. So for example, many string hello here. And then we have something different like forum hello. Like JavaScript will have no idea what this forum hello is. Question? Oh, good.
So you call it like, you can name it any name because in that path, there's only one function, so you can just name it however you like.
Yes. Yes.
If you've got multiple functions, you have to like import the correct function to the correct. Like you have to do like export function name.
That's a very good question. So now we only have one single function that was exported. So we can use export default and only single function. So what if we have more functions that we had in this helper function file, and we want to export more than one functions? What should we do? The way we do that is by using a different way, which is called it's called named export. I'm trying to find the slide. Yeah, it's called named export. So now you can see that in this example, I had two functions, which include many string function and also another add bracket functions. Add brackets function. So there are two functions in this file, and I want to export both of them. What should we do? Instead of export default, followed by the functions, the single function name, we use export and bracket. In the bracket are the functions name that we want to export. So it's also okay if we have, for example, another function here. We have three functions, but we are only exporting two of them. It's also okay. Just put the name of the function that you want to export in the bracket after export. And then how do we use them? Like after we import, after we export, how do we import in this case? The way is, we'll open the file export name. I'll show you here. So here are the two functions. We export both of them. The way we import is by import bracket the function's name from this file. And then we can use these functions. Now my question is, with the different way of exporting, importing, which is called named export, can we change the name of many strings now into, for example, forum hello? No, we can't. So we can't directly change this into forum hello. It will have no idea what this forum hello is. They can't find this function from here, this file. Right, so they need to be consistent. So I change it back. Yeah, so this is how we do exporting and then importing functions. So we can define our own functions and call those functions in another file. So this can be very useful when we want to have very clear flow that in our code is easier to read. Like we don't have a lot of helper functions in the file, and the file will become very, very big, very, very long. Yeah, question?
We'll leave the header file and the main file in the same direction.
So what did you mean?
Like you have the header file, which is called multi-export main something, and then if this file is in a different directory. Then
Oh,
name the
okay.
file, what should we do?
So the question is, now my helper function and my main function, they are under the same folder. So we can just directly direct from this one. So what your question was, what if they are under different folders?
Yeah.
This is just a directory. So you can just change the directory. So for example, you can have folder like that. You can change that. You change to the folder where you had this helper function file. Okay. Any other questions? Yep.
Just add one more dot at the beginning of the
2 dots. When we write the directory, when we have 2 dots, it means that we are going to the upper folder. Yeah. Yeah. So it's just a directory here. So it doesn't matter where this file is. It just you have the directory to this file, so that when we import the functions, we know where to find the file which has the functions. Okay. So for example, what if I really don't like this many string name, which is too broad, too general? I really want to customize it to make it for my forum project. What can I do? So the way that we can do is by using as. So I'll show you in the slides first. Yeah, so what you can do is, for example, in your original helper, the file, the function was named as sum. You can still use sum as simple sum. So similarly here, you can still have many string as forum hello. And then you can use forum hello instead of many string. But you can't just directly have forum hello here. Otherwise, JavaScript will have no idea what you mean by forum hello. But you can force it to rename it by using as. Any question? Oh, good. It's pretty straightforward. Okay. Okay, so you can see that there are 2 types of, 2 ways to export and import. One is called default export, where you are exporting one single function. But there's also another one called named export, where you can export multiple functions by using export bracket. And importing can also be different here. The syntax is also different. In general, try to use name export, even if you only have one function in the file that you want to export. The reason being that it's more flexible. It means that in the future, if you want to add a function, you can just add the function and add the function name in the bracket, rather than changing the syntax, like delete the default and add the bracket and then add a name or whatever. So it's more flexible. Another reason is, if you started with default export, maybe in the main JavaScript file, you change the name because it was original as default export. So in the main file, you change the name, and later on you change the helper function file into named export, and then in the main file have no idea what you are importing because you changed the name. You need to change everywhere when you call the function. Does that make sense? So named export is more flexible. So even though at the beginning you only have one function to export, right? We still suggest that we use named export. Cool. So if we are importing or exporting a lot of things, a lot of functions, you can just break it into different lines. It's the same. It's just the format. Yeah, I'm just checking all the advocate and mainstream. Oh, there's a very good question from online. So let's have a look at this example again. We are importing multiple functions from this multi-export lib. So that's the order matters. So for example, in the helper function file, we had two functions, many strings and add bracket. We had many strings first, add bracket first. And when we export, we also export many string here and add bracket here. And when we import them, we also had the same order. Does this matter? Can we change the order? The answer is yes, we can. We can still change the order because the name tells JavaScript which function we are referring to. We are not changing the name, right? So the order doesn't matter. Okay, cool. Any other questions before we move on? Question? No? Okay. Going back to the slides. Yay, perfect. So that's everything for this importing, exporting, multi-file functions for JavaScript. Very straightforward, very easy. Again, you will notice that learning a second language is so much easier than learning the first one. Okay, sorry, we'll need to go back to the boring part, which is the requirement engineering. Okay, I'll try to wrap it up as soon as I can. Okay, cool. Let's go back to user stories. So we have finished talking about how to write user stories. We also talked about the user acceptance criteria, like the stick examples. And those kind of user acceptance criteria is called rule-based criteria. So each bullet point is a rule. So this is one way of writing user acceptance criteria. But there's also another way to write user acceptance criteria, which is called scenario-based or scenario-oriented. So for example, we have a user story as a user, I want to be able to recover the password to my account so that I will be able to access my account in case I forgot a password. Now we write the user acceptance criteria as a scenario, and the name, or can give a name of this scenario as forgot password. And in a scenario, we have a given, like a precondition, like the user has already navigated to the login page. And the trigger is in this when, like the user selected the forgotten password option. So this is the trigger. And end, so there are two things that need to happen, not just the user selected forget password option, but also they entered a valid email to receive a link for the password recovery. Okay, after everything has been done, then the system will send a link to the entered email. All right, so you can see that there, for scenario-oriented user acceptance criteria, looks a bit similar to use cases now. But still, the most important part is this user story. But below is the user acceptance criteria that can also be useful for the developers to know what they need to implement to make sure that these user stories completed or successful. So which one should we use? We don't have a preference. So I think the rule-based acceptance criteria is simpler, just some bullet points. Like the scenario-based one is more complete with more details, but also it's more complicated, more text, it's more lengthy. But the scenario-based acceptance criteria are more likely to be implemented as tests, because there are some logic, like what happens first and then what happens next, what are the conditions. Oh, I don't want to talk more about that. Okay, so that's it about user story. So the last not exciting thing is validation. So next week we'll go back to coding, programming, JavaScript, servers and stuff. So yeah, this week we just have to do that because they are so important. Although they are less exciting, but they are so important. So the last phase in requirement engineering is called validation. So after we identified those requirements in use cases or user stories, before we implement them, we still need to validate them. So why do we need to do that? So the reason is we want to make sure that we have the right plan to build the right system. Okay, so this is called validation. And mainly just to make sure that the right system will be built. In this course, we'll also talk about verification, but it's different. So verification makes sure that the system will be built right. It means testing. So we'll also do a lot of testing in this course, like unit testing, static testing, dynamic testing. So it's test the software behave as what we intended. But before any of those testing, we first need to make sure that we are on the right direction, that we have the right plan, the right system will be built. It's called validation. Why do we need to validate? We have already talked with the stakeholders. We already done the analysis following the right process. But why do we still need to validate? So that at this phase, we aim to pick up any problem before resources are committed to address the requirement. So put any human effort, any time commitment. So pick up any problem before that, to make sure that requirement document defines the right problem that we will solve. But how do we validate? So now we understand why do we validate, but how? There are a couple of ways to validate. The first one is called requirements reviews. This is the process, like we sit down with the stakeholders, the whole team, we read through the requirements and make sure that we have a consensus idea about what this terminology means, what that user story means, or is there anything vague in the user stories or use cases. So that is requirement review. So we review those requirements, make sure that everything is clear, not vague, is precise, as complete as possible. So that's called requirement reviews. Prototyping. Oh, I love this one. So anyone have heard of prototyping? Yeah, most of you. So where did you heard about prototyping? Is it in the world of software engineering or different? Mechanical engineering? Yeah. Yeah, so prototyping is it's a pretty broad word. So it's not just only useful in software engineering. So what is prototyping? It's making something to test out. So let's give an example first. So for example, you want to build an aircraft. And you are not sure whether what you have planned for this aircraft is the same as what the clients want. Would you just build the whole aircraft and show it to the stakeholders and ask, is this what you want? And then the client said, no, it isn't. Build from scratch, start again. That's a waste of time and effort and money and everything, right? So what prototype does is you can maybe use some paper, some like wooden blocks, or even using some softwares to build something that is represents what this aircraft looks like. But it's not a real complete aircraft. So this is the same in the case of software engineering, in the world of software engineering. So you do not need to build a whole system and show it to the client, and the client says, no, this is not what I want. But for example, you can just have a piece of paper, draw on the paper like how the interface looks like. Show the client how the user can potentially interact with the app. Where are the buttons? How the button looks like. How the login page looks like. How the forum post looks like. Show them. You can just draw on a piece of paper. Right? And then the client can give some feedback and say, oh, I want to change here, I want to change there. Right? And then it's much faster to get feedback rather than you build the whole thing. So this is called prototyping. So by prototyping, the easiest way is just to draw on the paper. Draw the first on like how the login looks like. On another page, how the forum post looks like. On another page, like how the admin dashboard looks like. But you can have more advanced version of the prototype. So drawing on the paper is called low fidelity prototype. But there's also high fidelity prototype. So for example, after the drawing has been approved by the client, you want to confirm more details before implementing. For example, you want to confirm the color, the font, the size, the content, or whatever before implementing the system. You can use some tools. So for example, a tool that I like to use is called Figma. So Figma is a free software that can help you build very fast before actually implement something. This is a very powerful application that you can use. It's a prototype, but no coding involved at all. And you can click a button, switch to a different page. And you can even text, like put in text. So you can pretend interacting with the system without putting in any coding effort. So for example, after you have a prototype using Figma, and the client says, I want this button, the setting button, moved to here. I don't like this bar here, I want to change it. It's very easy, very fast to change. And once the clients are happy with this prototype, you can start implementing it, like do the actual coding, building the server, designing the interface or whatever. Right. Prototyping is a very powerful tool. Okay. So you can just click on somewhere, and then you can add a button that it is clickable. Okay, perfect. So that is prototyping. So prototyping is the most popular and most commonly used one in industry for validation. But there's also acceptance test. So acceptance test, what does it mean? So by definition, acceptance test is a formal testing with respect to users' need, requirement, and business process. And it's conducted to determine whether or not a system satisfies the acceptance criteria and enable the user, customer, or other authorized entities to determine whether or not to accept the system. So very lengthy definition, but this is its definition. How to do this user acceptance test? We can have a prototype first and bring this prototype to potential users and ask them to use the prototype and then give some feedback. Or sometimes an MVP also works. So MVP is a more advanced version of prototype. So for Figma prototype. So Figma prototype is no coding at all. But if the Figma prototype is approved, you can move on to build an MVP, which may not be that perfect. The color, the font, the button, or whatever is not that perfect, but it's usable. And you can bring this MVP to end users and ask them to use it. And you observe them use the system. And you may notice that the users may sometimes be blocked at some point, like they have no idea where to find a button. It means that the button may not be designed ideal. You need to change the design of it. Or you may notice that there's a feature that the user has never used. Maybe that feature is not that usable. Maybe because at the interview or at the requirement engineering, the initial phase, a lot of clients say they want this feature. But actually when you give the MVP for the user to use, they actually never use it. It's not as important as they imagine. So user acceptance testing is also very useful. And this testing is always black boxed, means that the user or whoever taking this test, they do not need to understand what is happening in the system, like technical detail. They only need to know how they interact with the system. So again, everything in requirement engineering do not require the stakeholders to understand any technical details. It's black boxed. Oh, finally, I've finished that. Personally, I really like requirement engineering, but every time I teach this lecture to our software engineering or computer science students, I find it's really hard to make you excited. I'll try to figure out a way. But if you have any comments, any feedback for me to improve these lectures, please do let me know. Yeah, I really want to emphasize the importance of requirement engineering. Maybe because it's less exciting, so I finished the lecture pretty quick. So yeah, that's everything for today. Next week, we'll talk more about actually building the server. So you can find the lecture contents for next week. So we'll talk about testing next week. We'll talk about dynamic verification, static verification, linting. We'll also have an industry guest lecture next Thursday from Atlanta, from Nick. So he will talk about how he used the JavaScript and TypeScript during his daily life at tech companies. Okay, whew. That's all for today. Please do let me know if you have any idea how to improve this lecture to make it more exciting. Thank you so much.
So I have some team members that already messed up like creating branch names or merging. So like some of the functions they kind of merged it together in one branch. Stuff like that. How important is it?
So, merging
Yeah, but so should they redo it to get marked? Or is it fine? This is just merging. So yeah, we have. Like I was trying to help them, but it's kind of hard to explain it online.
So what you can do is also sometimes organize the letter to because we are still learning, so it's okay to make mistakes. So maybe they can make some techniques.
So they should just try to redo it. Just like
Have
the
you
code's already,
finished?
yeah, the code is already there.
So potentially what we can do is ask the form and we can create a new project repo for you that your team member they can practice. But it's not for marketing, it's more for like because you already done the project, your group has already done the project, and maybe you try to use that again.
Yeah, because he was trying to resubmit it, and I told him like it's already done, so he can't
Yeah,
resubmit.
it's already registered. So if they want to practice more, what we can do is we create a new project repo for your group, and then they can practice on that repo.
Thank you.
Every Thursday about midnight, the school will send out emails about recruiting to the next month. All you need to do is apply through the system. They will have to, just apply. So we will get yeah, we will have a list of students who apply. But it's very competitive. Yeah, very competitive. So to increase your chance of being a tutor, try to get good marks for the course and also overall.
Thank you.
It depends on what you do, like tutorials. And
Thank you.
Thank you. Tutorials and more like that.
他妈他从来不来学校，是我叫他的才来。
I think it was about
就是，而且这个人他甚至不会
volunteer hours.
放弃他。
Yeah, I can't remember exactly about that.
Okay. Is there any qualification that you need apart from marks?